What if a single decision, a delay, not an attack, could reshape the balance of power in the Middle East? In a region where every move is measured in consequences, reports suggesting that Donald Trump considered, and then postponed, strikes on Iran's energy infrastructure raise a critical question: was this restraint or strategy? Because in the shadow war between the United States and Iran, sometimes what doesn't happen is just as important as what does. The idea of targeting Iran's energy infrastructure is not new. Iran's oil facilities, pipelines, and export terminals are the backbone of its economy, and by extension, a critical pillar of its geopolitical power. Any direct strike on these assets would represent a major escalation. The title, "Trump Postpones Strikes on Iranian Energy Infrastructure," points toward a moment of high tension. To understand the significance of such a decision, we need to step back and examine the broader strategic environment. US-Iran relations, regional proxy conflicts, global oil markets, and the risks of triggering a wider war. The United States and Iran have been locked in a prolonged confrontation for decades. But tensions sharply escalated during Donald Trump's presidency, particularly after the US withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal in 2018. Following that withdrawal, Washington imposed sweeping economic sanctions aimed at crippling Iran's oil exports. In response, Iran gradually scaled back its nuclear commitments and increased its regional activities through allied groups. One of the most dangerous flashpoints came in 2019. A series of incidents shook global energy markets, including attacks on oil tankers and a major strike on Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq oil processing facility. The Abqaiq attack alone temporarily cut about 5% of the world's oil supply, sending shockwaves through the global economy. Although Iran denied direct responsibility, the US and its allies blamed Tehran. This moment brought the region dangerously close to open conflict. Then, in June 2019, Iran shot down a US surveillance drone. In response, the Trump administration reportedly approved military strikes, but called them off at the last minute. Trump halted the strikes just hours before execution, citing concerns over potential casualties and escalation. While those strikes were not confirmed for energy targets, the strategic conversation has long included Iran's oil sector as a high-value target in any potential conflict scenario. The idea that strikes were considered and postponed fits within a well-documented pattern of brinkmanship followed by restraint. Iran's energy sector is both its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. The country holds some of the world's largest reserves. Oil exports are a primary source of government revenue despite heavy sanctions. This is the foundation of the conflict. From a strategic standpoint, postponing strikes on Iran's energy infrastructure would not necessarily indicate weakness. In fact, it could reflect a calculated decision based on several key factors. First, the risk of regional escalation. Iran has a wide network of allied groups capable of retaliating across multiple countries. Any attack on its core economic assets could trigger responses not just in the Persian Gulf, but in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and even beyond. Second, global economic stability. Oil markets are highly sensitive to disruptions in the Middle East. A strike on Iran's infrastructure could lead to price spikes, supply shocks, and broader economic consequences, especially at a time when global markets are already volatile. Third, military proportionality. U.S. officials have historically weighed the scale of response carefully, as Trump himself reportedly stated after calling off the 2019 strikes, the potential loss of life needed to be considered relative to the initial incident. And finally, political calculations. Decisions about military action are never purely strategic. They are also shaped by domestic politics, international alliances, and long-term policy goals. In this context, postponing a strike could serve multiple purposes: maintaining pressure without triggering war, preserving strategic flexibility, and sending a signal without crossing a red line. At first glance, this might seem like a distant geopolitical issue, a decision made behind closed doors in Washington with implications for Tehran. But the reality is, decisions like these affect millions of people worldwide. Global oil prices influence everything from fuel costs to food prices. A conflict involving Iran could disrupt supply chains, increase inflation, and impact economies far beyond the Middle East. For people living in the region, the stakes are even higher. Military escalation could lead to instability, displacement, and long-term insecurity. And for the international community, the question remains, how close are we really to a major conflict? And how often is it quietly avoided at the last moment? Behind every postponed strike lies a deeper story, one of intelligence briefings, war room debates, economic calculations, and silent warnings sent through back channels. The question is no longer whether strikes were delayed, but why and what that decision reveals about the real balance of power between the United States and Iran. This balance is what we'll explore in the next part of our investigation, looking at the axis of resistance and the Hormuz dilemma. To be continued. To understand the significance of any potential strike on Iran's energy infrastructure, you have to look beyond Washington and Tehran and toward the entire geopolitical chessboard. Iran sits at the center of a regional network including Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen, its axis of resistance. This network provides strategic depth, allowing Iran to respond asymmetrically. Any direct strike risks activating this entire network. This is why energy infrastructure is such a sensitive target. It signals existential pressure. Now consider the economic dimension. Oil as leverage. Iran's oil output is restricted by sanctions, but targeting it physically would be economic warfare at the highest level. Here's the paradox. Damaging Iran's oil could actually increase global oil prices. Markets react to perceived risk. Even a limited strike could trigger fears of wider conflict, especially if Iran responds by threatening the Strait of Hormuz, where 1/5 of global oil passes daily. Any disruption would send prices soaring. For the United States, this creates a strategic dilemma. Weakening Iran economically could strengthen global price volatility. This economic feedback loop is one of the strongest arguments for restraint. Public rhetoric emphasizes strength, but behind the scenes, military planning is far more cautious. Launching strikes on energy infrastructure is not a simple operation. These targets are often heavily defended and geographically dispersed. Importantly, these facilities are tied to civilian economic systems, raising the risk of unintended humanitarian consequences. U.S. military doctrine typically emphasizes proportionality and clear objectives. This is where postponement becomes meaningful. Delaying allows for intelligence gathering, diplomatic signaling, and de-escalation through back channels like Oman, Switzerland, or Qatar. These back channels are critical in preventing misunderstandings. In our final segment, we'll look at the pattern of controlled escalation and what the future holds for this shadow war. If you look at U.S.-Iran interactions over the past decade, a clear pattern emerges: controlled escalation. A provocation occurs, a response is prepared or executed, signals are sent to limit further escalation, and both sides step back from the brink. We saw this after the 2019 drone incident. We saw it after the Soleimani strike in 2020, and we continue to see it in various forms across the region. This pattern suggests that both sides understand the cost of full-scale war and are actively trying to avoid it even while projecting strength. In this context, postponing strikes on Iran's energy infrastructure fits perfectly. It allows the U.S. to maintain pressure and credibility without crossing a threshold that could trigger uncontrollable escalation. The real question is not just what happened, but what it means going forward. The Middle East remains one of the most volatile regions in the world. Tensions involving Iran continue to evolve, influenced by nuclear negotiations and regional conflicts. Any future U.S. administration will face similar strategic dilemmas. How to contain Iran's influence, protect global energy flows, and avoid another large-scale war. Strikes on energy infrastructure will likely remain an option, but one used with extreme caution. Meanwhile, Iran continues to adapt, investing in missile and drone technology. In today's interconnected world, regional conflicts don't stay regional. A decision in Washington can affect oil prices in Europe, shipping routes in Asia, and inflation rates globally. It can influence elections and reshape entire economies. More importantly, it highlights how close the world can come to major conflict, and how often those moments are managed quietly, without headlines. The postponement of a strike may not make the news like an actual attack, but it is often the more important story. Because it reveals the limits of power. Thank you for joining us on this investigation into the shadow war. Good night.